And as I said, you've been with us for a really long time. Ava's an incredible speaker, and I have been so lucky to develop a friendship with her, as have many others on our staff. So she's generously agreed to share her story with us this morning. So does anybody have any questions before we get started? Perfect. And we will have time for Q&A at the end, and then kind of a debrief and discussion about today and yesterday as well. So if you need water or anything like that, feel free to grab it. And for me, I usually turn off my camera when I'm listening to speakers, just because I find it kind of distracting to see myself on the screen, but it's totally up to you if you want to stay tuned in.
Well, I like when you got, but I like to see everybody's faces.
Oh, well, then I take it back. Well, I'll stay tuned in.
Because otherwise it feels like I'm talking to myself.
Okay. No problem. Well, we're here.
And I am not as good as talking to myself as to others.
I don't think most people are, but I don't know. I could be wrong about that. Okay, so without further ado, if you want to get started and start telling us a little bit about your life and your experiences during the Holocaust.
Okay. I was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1941. This was my birth father, who was murdered before I was 2 by the Nazis. And this is my mother and my stepfather. So I just thought I can introduce you to who I was that way. I was born into what you call is the Jewish hierarchy. My mother's father spoke 22 languages, and he was Franz Joseph's personal interpreter for a while. And when he retired from that, Franz Joseph had given him a baronhood and some lands, and he became a Baron Kohn, K-O-H-N, which is not very common in Hungary. And they lived in sort of a castle in northern part of Hungary, bordering Czechoslovakia. And the reason I'm mentioning this, because it has a lot to do with what happened to my family during the Holocaust. My grandfather also worked with the Jewish, with the underground, trying to save Jews from Poland and Czechoslovakia. Because of his title, he was able to go with his coach back and forth to Czechoslovakia and Hungary. And each time he went over there, they would have people who needed to escape from Czechoslovakia or Poland. They would wait for him at the border, and he would bring them to the estate, and they would stay there until they could find a place for them to go to safely away. And so that's how he was involved in the whole thing. As I mentioned, my father, may he rest in peace, had a factory in Budapest. They were making cabinets. And he was in the Hungarian army when I was born, which was in 1941. But because he was a Jew, he wasn't a soldier, he was the workforce for the Hungarian army. And for my first birthday, which is the picture of here, me and my first birthday, he escaped to bring me the doll I showed you on a picture, and because of that, they had when he went back, they had punished him, and he became very ill. And then before end of the year in 1942, they had make him dig his own grave, shot him, and buried him alive. And my stepfather, who was his best friend, was a witness to this. And he wrote to my mother and told her that he was murdered, so she knew. And I spent the rest of my time with my grandfather for a while, because my mother was trying to run the business, hoping, in Budapest. My first memory of by the way, I am severely dyslexic. I don't know if you guys know what that is. I apparently have a very high IQ. I was tested at UCLA because I always wanted to know if I was too dummy or too smart, because I can't spell my name. And so I was tested, and apparently I have a very high IQ. but my dyslexia level is the same as that. And so I literally, if I am stressed, I can't even spell my name, which has 3 letters in it, without making a mistake. So, but ever since I was a small child, I had trained myself to visualize and learn everything visually. And so I can, what I'm going to be described to you, it's like a picture I'm still seeing. My first memory of anything to do with the Holocaust was when I was about 1.5 years old. And I was with my mother. My mother used to come every Thursday evening to the estate to spend some time with me and also spend the Sabbath in my grandfather's estate. My grandparents were modern Orthodox, and one Saturday night after sundown, my mom would told me that I did not have to go to sleep that night because we're going to have an art party. And I was so excited. I mean, you guys remember what is it like when your parents tell you to go to sleep and that you have a day off and you don't have to go to sleep early. I was so excited. I remember I thought I was ecstatic that I was a big enough girl now not to go to sleep early. And I remember coming down to the main room of the estate, and I noticed that right away that my mother, sisters, that she had 4 sisters and 2 brothers. The 2 brothers were in work camp, and the 4 sisters were there because their husbands were also in a work camp. So they all stayed at the estate with their children. And I noticed that all my aunts and my cousins, they were very sad. I was the youngest in the family. And I remember being very, very sad and had tears, and they were whispering, and somehow it didn't match to me what was an art event, because to me, art was always so much fun. And they told me just sit on a corner, and they gave me some paper and glue, and all of a sudden I had little yellow pieces of material to make a collage with. What they were doing is they were cutting out yellow stars and putting it on the clothes, because from that day on, Hungary had a curfew, and the Jews had to wear a yellow star to identify themselves as they were Jewish. Now, not only the Jews had to be identified, the homosexuals, the gypsies, they all had different kind of symbols that they had to put on their clothes, so when they were on the street, they could be identified. And also because that meant that they are undesirable and they were less than the rest of the population. And I remember seeing my relatives being so upset, and I couldn't understand how can a yellow star make people so upset. I was too young, and of course nobody explained it to me at that point. The next thing I remember of anything to do with the Holocaust was it must have been about 6 months later or so, when, as I mentioned, that somebody turned my grandfather in for saving the Jews. And I remember being upstairs on the 2nd floor with my governess, and all of a sudden we heard trucks coming into the courtyard, and that was pretty unusual in end of 1942 to have trucks in the villages. Most people had horse and carriage, and my governor, and then we heard shouting, and we heard even guns being fired off. So my governess told me to stay upstairs until she finds out what was going on. And she was this big peasant lady, and she was the kind of person who always made me feel very secure and knew that she could fight anybody off, and she would not be, and she was a young woman, but she was this big, hearty young lady. And she must have been in her late teens or early 20s. And I remember she walked up to where I was in my room, and she was white as the snow. She was shaking and she was stuttering. And it right away made me feel uncomfortable, because this woman who I trusted that she wouldn't be afraid of anything, she was acting very strange. then she instructed me to take one item with me, and that we're gonna go on hide and seek game. And if anybody sees me, or if anybody wants to talk to me, I should act like if I was deaf and dumb. And we're gonna go through part of the estate I have never seen before. And she thought it was part of the game. And I was excited because it was supposedly a game, but and then I remember she held my hand very tight and she told me I can take one thing with me. And I took my doll because it was my most precious thing in the world to me at that time. And I remember holding the doll on one hand and holding her hand on the other, my other hand. And she kept on telling me to be very quiet. And we were going through the hallways of the estate, which I have never, I mean, the castle type place, which I have never been before. And then we went outside and we ended up in the side of the building where the servers' quarters were. My grandfather had one-bedroom apartments built next to the big estate. So all the families had their own apartments, but they were not inside of the family unit. And we went on the side, and I never been that far of the house before. And then I saw that my relatives were pushed on the trucks. And I remember seeing my great-grandmother and my grandfather, and they were upset, and the women were crying, and the army people were yelling at them. And what I picked up out of that is that they're going on a trip and I'm not going with them. And I felt sort of left out. And I was trying to wave, getting their attention. And my governess grabbed my arm and said, I told you, act like if you don't, nobody knows you. And I didn't understand it. I didn't understand how come my relatives are not paying attention to me and how come I am not allowed to do anything to bring their attention to me. I remember being very hurt. And then we were going into her house. And then I heard that she was telling something to her mother and they were whispering. And then they told me that I should take off my dress and I should dress as a little peasant kid. And I thought it was Halloween, it was fine. So I got all dressed up as a little peasant kid with a babushka and everything. And then they told me that as long as I do not talk to anybody except the kids in the household, I can go out in the yard. And I remember going out in the yard with my peasant dress, and I was trying to get my relatives' attention because they were still putting things on the truck, and nobody paid attention to me. And then the evening came, and then the trucks moved away, and nobody waved at me or anything. And I remember being pretty hurt. And the evening came, and I thought we're gonna go back to my house and my bedroom house to eat dinner. And she told me that a part of the game was that I'm gonna have dinner with them, and then I also gonna sleep there. And this was the first time I slept away from my family. And I remember being in this peasant house where everybody in the whole family slept in the same bedroom. And I remember this heavy feather bed and everything. And I guess I slept pretty good comparatively. And the next morning, she told me that we're gonna go to take a trip to visit my mother in Budapest, but that I should not put on my regular dress, that I should wear the same little peasant dress I wore the day before. And also that if we go on the trip, I should not talk to anybody, and I should not let anybody know who I was. And I remember everybody was acting very strange. They were very nervous. I felt very uncomfortable, and the first time in my life I felt something which must have been fear, which I didn't even know before, because I knew that the adults around me were acting so weird. And then we went back to Budapest, and by this time the underground had notified my mom, telling them that my family were taken away and that she needs to pack a bag. And once I come back to Budapest, she and I need to go into hiding for a while until all these things blow over, because the government had my name and her name also on the list to be picked up, and they will look for me. And so My mother, when I got back to my Budapest to see my mother, she already had an overnight bag packed for me and for herself, and we were said goodbye to my governess. She went back to the estate, and then somebody came for us in an hour or so, and then we had left the apartment. I remember also I was instructed not to talk to anybody if I see anybody, and I should just be this. I should be not heard or seen. I should be disappearing. And I remember we were taken into a place, and we were in somebody's house, and we were hidden in a room. And but the so-called short time had turned into 2 years. I ended up being hidden from an age of 2 or so until 4.5, until 1945, when the war ended. Uh, we were hidden about 10 or 12 different places, because what happened was is that the people who were hiding us, after a while, they felt that they were in jeopardy, and they didn't want anybody to, they didn't want to end up being caught, because the Nazis would punish them also because they were hiding a Jew. So every few weeks or so, somebody said, they said to the underground, you need to take them away. And then each time they had to find another place for us to hide. And we were always been transported at night, because during the day we were not supposed to be seen. And I remember some being literally going from doorway to doorway at night and hiding. And many times my mouth was either taped or my mother's hand was on it, so I won't make any sound. And some of the places I still remember, the places we were hidden. We were hidden in people's homes, sometimes in closets, sometimes in storage rooms, sometimes and actually maybe had a bed to sleep in. Most of the time it was on the floor somewhere, or in a closet, or something. We were hidden in attics and hallways, and everywhere they could find a place to hide us temporary. One of the things which really stood out in my mind is that a person actually dug a hole in the middle of the living room, and they lined it with some kind of material, and they had put a plywood on the top with holes in it so we could breathe. And there was a table and 4 chairs put on the top of it. And so during the day, if anybody walked through the house, it looked like it was just a regular room, but we had to be underneath. Most of the time we were in a semi-lying position, because the places we were hidden were not big enough to stand up or sit up. My mother, when we were told that we need to go into hiding, took all the cash she could find and all the jewelry she had, because she knew that the people who were hiding us will have to feed us. But that money disappeared very quickly, and the jewelry was sold in the black market, and whatever they got for it, we got fed with. And after a while, there was nothing to sell. But my mother was an extremely handy person. She was able to knit and crochet anything. And she was basically knitting day and night. I mean, I heard in those years they had the metal knitting needles, and if I close my eyes, I can still hear the clicking of the needles day and night. So obviously I have never learned how to knit, or never learned how to crochet, or even thread a needle. I look like I'm committing suicide. Meantime, I'm a silversmith and an artist, but I can't do anything normal like that. And so I remember always hearing the knitting needles. And so it's when I see somebody knitting, that's what reminds me of my childhood. My mother, what they ever could buy us, they feed us with. And my mother wanted to make sure that I would get fed, so she gave me most of her portion. So she became skinnier and skinnier. She was like hardly weighed anything by the time the war ended. We were about 6 months into hiding. when the underground found the little girl who was all by herself crying in the street, and they discovered that her parents were taken away, and somehow she managed to escape from that. And they gave her to my mom. Her name was Valerie. Uh, so they figured if she's hiding with one kid, two kids couldn't be that much worse, which was very nice for me because I had somebody pretty much my age. She was a few months younger than me, and we shared my doll, and we became very, very close. But it was much more difficult for the people to find us hiding places because now they had to find a hiding place for an adult and two kids. Some of the I remember being hidden in closets where somebody opened the door and things would fall down, and my mother would cover our bodies so we won't get the things just falling down on top of us because, uh, I don't remember seeing any sunlight or any fresh air for like 2.5 years because each time we were taken, it was at night. And during the day or during the rest of the time when we were hidden, it was always enclosures where there was not much fresh air. There was always the smell of mildew and on, it was just not very savory places. Uh, the, in 1943, I think, by that time they were starting to deport Hungarian Jews as well. We were caught once when we were going from one place to the other. And I remember they grabbed us and very roughly, the two of us, the kids were thrown into one truck and my mother was pushed on another truck. And apparently they were going to take us to one of the holding stations before they were deporting us. And I remember being in the corner of the truck. We were so short that as the sides on the truck, the old-fashioned trucks that those little sticks in the sides. Well, I could only see out of the very bottom just a little bit, and I saw 4 men on horse dressed as SS men following the truck. And by this time, each time I had anything to do with the uniform, it scared the daylights out of me. And I remember my stomach was churning. Plus, by this time, I had some kind of disease. I picked something up in some of those unsavory places where we were hidden. And my stomach was turning and churning, and I was feeling sick. And meantime, I thought that I had to protect my little friend because I was the older one. And I kept on pushing her in a corner of the truck, hoping that nobody gonna see us because we were told never to be seen or heard. And all of a sudden, 2 of these Nazi men climbed on the truck and were going through the children's kids. They were checking the kids out. And I kept on feeling more and more in danger. And all of a sudden, they got to us and they grabbed us and threw us off the side of the truck into the arm of the other 2 men who were on horseback. And I remember completely losing it. I remember throwing up and soiling myself. And I remember feeling so self-hatred and self-disgust because not only that I didn't protect my little friend, but I lost it. I totally lost my control of my body. And I remember sobbing, and the Nazi whose horse I was on didn't pay any attention to me at all. All of a sudden we go to part of the city and they stop and they take me off the horse, and guess what? My mother was there. These people were not Nazis. They were the underground who had actually saved our lives. And I remember having my biggest thing, the best thing ever happened to me the past year or so. I actually had a bath. I remember they put me into a little wooden tub in the cellar and washed me with warm water. I remember the water going through, feeling that it washed away all this shame and dirt and everything. And I remember even getting something warm to drink. That was a very unusual thing for this because even when they fed us something, whatever they could find as a piece of bread or maybe once in a while a piece of cheese or some water, but no, I don't remember having something warm to nourish me. And I remember after the bed getting a cup of or something warm to drink. And I remember the feeling of the warmth going through my body and literally warming me up everywhere and making me feel so much better about life. And then we were taken into a cellar, and we were in the cellar. These people had an area in a corner fixed up in front of sacks of potatoes and other kind of root vegetables were put into earth for the winter. In Hungary, there is 4 months of snow, pretty much. And during that time, all summer, people putting food away for the winter. And the root vegetables are stuff which you can put away, is not going to rot as easily. And if they put it on earth, it may have some sprouts on it, but it won't go dead so quickly. But it also has a certain kind of mildewy smell. So I remember there was this little area back in the back of the cellar where they had these sacks of potatoes and root vegetables lined up, and we were behind it. They made us up a little place where we could actually stay. And the only problem was in that area that beside us, there were a bunch of rats and other bugs and stuff were crawling around all the time. I remember the eyes of the rodents looking at us and they making these funny sounds. And I remember my mother trying to push them away. You know, when you are in elementary school in America, they have this little white mouse and stuff which in a cage, and the parents can have it on the weekend. When my kids brought it over to me, I just thought I was going to have a fit, because they wanted to, and I didn't know how to explain it to them that I can't have anything like that in the house. But anyhow, so that was one of the places we were hidden, and I remember bugs crawling, and it was just. But anyhow, we were there for a while, and then in 1945, the Hungarians, which were known to be pretty anti-Semitic anyhow, they decided they didn't want any kind of witnesses left, especially when the Allies were coming in. The Russians were coming from the east, and from the west came the Americans and the English. So they wanted to get rid of all the Jews to make sure that there would be no witnesses left. And they searched each house in Budapest, and if they found anybody Jewish or Gypsy or anybody else who was hiding, homosexuals or anybody who was undesirable, they would drag us to the Danube, tie 2 or 3 people together and shoot them into the river, where the river was running the fastest. And they used 1 bullet because they didn't want to waste bullets on a bunch of undesirable people. So when the one person who was shot pulled the other 3 or 4 down, you could hear the gurgling, the begging, the dying sounds. So my mother and my friend and I were caught, and they took us to the Danube, and my mother told, and it was March in 1945, the edge of the river still had some ice in it, and it was cold as a witch's tit. I'm sorry to say this, I shouldn't have, I know. And yeah, it was very cold, and we were not dressed for an outing, and my mother said that if we will cover our eyes and put our fingers in our ear, we will be warmer. Well, the reason she said that, because she thought that if we won't see and we don't hear, we will not be petrified. But I never follow instructions, obviously. And I remember opening my fingers and looking through and pulling my finger out of my ear. And I saw and heard everything. And we were at the end of the line, and each time we heard the guns go off, and the plash of the people falling into the water, and then all the gurgling sound and begging, and then people disappearing, and another bench came up. Each time we were moved further and further up near to the water, I mean, near to the edge of the line. And at one point, we were in the front of the firing squad. There were two men. By this time, the rest of them left because there was only a few Jews left. And there were two guys with the guns, and then and they were the ones also who were wrapping the rope around us. And I remember, because my mother told me to put my hand up here, I still had my hand up here. And I remember they pulled me with my mom and my friend to my mom and wrapped the rope around us. I remember the rope, I was so short that the rope hit me where my mother's legs were. And I could barely breathe and I couldn't move. And I remember all of a sudden, I heard this man looking at my mom and saying, "You dirty Jew, I know who you are. You lived in the same apartment house as I lived before the war started. And since the way how things are, we may lose the war and I will need somebody to testify that I had saved a Jew. If you promise to do that for me, I will not shoot to kill." My mother, of course, agreed. And I remember the three of us being dragged, literally dragged on the pavement for several feet or yards. I don't know. It seemed forever. And then I heard the gun being shot. And then all of a sudden we were in the water. But where we fell in, it was not where the water was rushing fast, but it was at the edge of the river where they were growth, a tree was growing, with the roots. You know how sometimes at the edge where there is not, the water is not deep, things grow. We fell in there. And I remember my mother wiggling so our faces will not hit the water. And we were there, I don't know how long. We could have been for hours, but it seemed like hours, but we probably weren't because we would have frozen to death. And then somebody came and pulled us out of the water. Now, I don't know for sure if it is the guy who shot us into the water who pulled us out, or the underground who had followed us had pulled us out. But somebody pulled us out, cut the ropes. I remember taking us to our last hiding place. I remember having my second bath and my second warm drink. And I remember literally being defrosted. I mean, because by this time I didn't have any sensation in my feet or my body. I felt like I was totally frozen. As a matter of fact, I couldn't even walk. They had to sort of carry me and my friend. And then we were taken to this place where we were washed again, cleaned. And this time we were taken into a house, not into alley. I mean, not in these other kind of places. And we were in a room. Then I just turn this up. We were in a room where other people were in there, mainly older men and older women. There were no children. There were a couple of middle-aged women. There was no young men at all because they were already in a war camp or killed. And there must have been about 15 of us in this room. There was no blankets or pillows or anything. We were told to find a place to hide, to live. And we went my mother has always dragged us into the corner of the room. And we were a little corner, and that's where we were. And this man and the windows were covered with black or dark paper, and their lights were never turned on. We were allowed to go to the bathroom once a day. We were literally assigned time when each of us could go to the bathroom. Now, I was 4.5 years old. You have to sort of imagine what it's like when you could not go to the bathroom when you had to. You basically had to control your body. But this happened for the past 2.5 years because the places we were hidden, we were not privileged to have bathroom most of the time. But we were assigned time to go to the bathroom and maybe wash our faces and something. But by this time I was so psychologically affected that any sound would wake me up even if I was sleeping. And I remember sleeping in the corner in my mother's arm. She had one arm on one of us kids and the other arm the other. And all of a sudden the door opened and there was 3 men at the doorway. The man it was in 1945. Um, the man whose house we were at, and 2 other persons in a uniform with the guns on their shoulder. Now, uh, we, as I mentioned it before, that I visually learn everything because of my dyslexia. So I right away focused on the fact that these men were not dressed in dark uniforms. They had khaki uniforms on. They had a hat with a little gold strip and a gold star in here with a red, thing around it. I did not know that this meant that these were the liberating forces of the Soviet Union. I only saw 2 men with the guns at the door. So I started to whimper, and my little friend always followed what I did. I was the older one. So she started to whimper, and my mom put her arms out, hoping that she would calm us down, because she realized that these people were not the Nazi soldiers. And as she was trying to calm us down, one of the soldiers noticed that in the corner there were 2 little kids. And he decided to come to us. And I remember seeing all of a sudden there was this pair of shiny boots and a pair of khaki pants and a hand going into a pocket. I was too short to see the rest of him. And then when the hand went into a pocket, I was so nervous. I was so afraid, because until then, each time I had any kind of relationship with anybody in a uniform was always harmful. So I was all nervous, and then he put something out of his pocket. I remember he pulled the paper off of it, ripped it into half, and shoved it into our mouth. It was a piece of chocolate. That was the greatest thing I ever had in my life. I thought that this must be heaven. I have this delicious thing in my mouth. I didn't even know what it was. I remember the feeling of the melted chocolate going down my throat, and I felt that it had to be heaven. To this day, if you open my freezer, there is this much chocolate and there is very little other food in there. But there's a lot of chocolate, because if anything goes wrong in my life, I need to take a bath and I have to have a piece of chocolate, in that order, or sometimes both in the same time. And then the man went back to the window and pulled all the things off, and the persons whose house we were told us that the Soviet army is liberating Budapest. They are literally fighting house to house. And while we don't have to be hidden anymore, but we still cannot go on the streets, because the bullets will not know who is a Jew and who is a Nazi, and that we needed to stay in the compound house. But once a day we are able to go out into the yard to have a little fresh air. I remember the first time they took my mother and my friend and I to the yard to sit in a corner, and I felt the sunshine. It took me a long time to have my eyes get used to the light. You know that feeling when you first open your eyes sometimes, and you have these little circles and sensation of both pleasure and pain. Well, that's how I felt. I remember couldn't believe that there was such a thing as light, that I could actually see forms and identify things. And but I was by this time very, very sick. My mother used to use a little washcloth to wipe my face so people would not know that I was running a fever, because she was afraid that they would not keep us if they know that I was running a fever. We were there about a couple of weeks when we were told that we are able to leave. And we had, my mother and I went to my grandfather's estate, and the little girl, Wally, was adopted by the head of the underground, who has been hiding us all these years, because he and his wife had no children and couldn't have any. And he liked this little girl, and she had nobody, so he adopted her. Anyhow, my mother and I went to the estate, hoping that if anybody survived the war, that's where they would come back to. The main building was taken over by the Russian soldiers. It became their headquarters. So we ended up staying with the same family who originally saved my life. I was very sickly and very weak, so I couldn't. I was usually carried out into the yard every day for a little bit, put on a blanket, and I was allowed to play with my doll, which would never leave my side. I would not even let it go long enough to they get it washed. I mean, this poor doll has been in the river twice. It was it was in hiding places. It was dirty and filthy, and I would not let it go out of my hand. When they washed me, they washed the dog, but it was obviously it uh, in a very bad shape. But I would not let it go. But they let me play with little chickens and ducklings because that's the only toys they had around there. So I remember feeling that sensation of my one hand, feeling the texture of the skin and the feathers and the softness of the little baby animals. And then one day my mother got a letter, and she came and told me that she's going to have to leave me behind. And when she comes back, she's going to have a major surprise for me. And she did, she left. And apparently, uh, my birth father's brother, who was a psychologist, was alive. And my mother and this man, Joseph, here, had got in touch with him, and they went to talk to him and wanted to know how to present the fact that my dad was murdered, and then he's going to adopt me and raise me as his own, because he promised my birth father that apparently the two men promised each other that whoever will survive, make sure that the other person's family will be okay. And he took it very seriously, and he asked my mom to marry him, and he adopted me. But anyhow, my uncle, who was a psychologist, suggested that since I was in such a bad shape that probably won't live too long because I was so sick, the best thing for me to not to know that this man wasn't my father, that they should tell me that he was my father, since I probably don't remember my father, which was true. And so when they came back, he came back with my mom, and he was introduced to me as my father. And he said to me, I heard that your doll is in such a bad shape. I got you a gift. And I remember this was the first time I ever got a gift since I could remember. It was something was wrapped up. And I remember letting my doll go long enough to rip the paper off, and the doll disappeared. And inside of this package was a brand new doll, one of those celluloid dolls, which I never seen before. I don't know where he got it after the war. And but I pushed it aside. I looked for my doll, and there's no more doll. Apparently, they figured that for my own health, they just gonna get rid of the doll. No, no, the new doll never was the same to me. I don't know whatever happened to it either. The three of us went back to live in Budapest. Um, in my stepfather, who was a very, very decent human being and a very good man, he found a place in Újpest, which is a suburb of Budapest, which was a bombed down building, but it had part of the unit was still livable. And we lived there. And then his one sister came back from the war, and she came there. So we all lived in this one little place. And then each time when he had a little money, he added on some extra. So by the time we left Hungary, this place became a 3-bedroom luxury apartment. But it was very strange because as each year they added on, it was like very long. We literally had to go through every room to get to the next room. It was a very strange construction, but that's where we lived. I went to school. I went to elementary school, junior high, and part of high school in Budapest. I was the only Jewish kid left in the school I went to. There was 1,000 girls. I was the only one, and I didn't look like anybody. I didn't act like anybody. I didn't feel like anybody. Even though that under the communistic era, you are not supposed to be separated who you are. I mean, they tell you that how much you stud, how much you produce, that's how much you worth, regardless who you are. There was anti-Semitism always. I remember coming home from school, with people, and I heard people saying the one in the middle is a Jew. I mean, they could tell. And I was in junior high school. I was a very good student, but I could not write to save my life. I could memorize anything. And pretty soon the teachers discovered that I memorized everything because I couldn't take notes. So every day before the class started, I had to stand up and recite the homework, which did not make me very popular with anybody because I showed them off. And they also realized that I could memorize the things that other children say. So they didn't want me to learn my homework in class. So that's why I had to get up each day and say my homework before anybody could say it in front of me. And so I was not a very popular kid. Plus my parents were so worried and so damaged during the Holocaust. My mother lost, between my combined family, we lost 96% of our family. My mother had one brother who survived. She lost 4 sisters and 2 other brothers. And my stepfather lost 10 siblings and all their family of parents, everybody, both sides. So they were so damaged that they were also so afraid that if I go into people's homes who are actually having anti-Semitic feelings, that they will say something which I shouldn't be hearing. So the people I was allowed to associate with it was a very small circle. And so I never felt part of anything. And I remember getting report cards. Actually, I have some here. And it says AAA, and then it says, we don't know what she writes. So, I mean, I never even was marked on it because they couldn't tell what I was writing. That's how bad my handwriting was. And that's how bad my spelling was. And then in my second year of high school, that's when the revolution was happening, and also there were uprisings everywhere. And we were in one of these assemblies, and they were talking about the difference between the Nazis and the communists. And a kid behind me said that the only mistakes the Nazis did is didn't kill the Jews, all the Jews. And I remember 15 years of hurt and anger and pain and unspoken emotions. I, who had never been hit in my life, and I have never hit anybody in my life, I turned around and I really beat this kid up. I am not proud of it, but the fact is, I could not control it. My anger and pain just all beat her up. And this was the same kid who's every day I would help with her homework because she couldn't add 2 and 2 together. And they took me to the principal's office, and they told me that not only am I gonna be expelled, but they're gonna make sure that no school will take me in Budapest because of the fact that I beat her up. Well, I was very smart, and I told them that under the communistic dogma, I was told that everybody worth as much as they produce, not where they come from. And I am a straight A student, and this kid is an F, and she would be flunked if I wouldn't help her every day with her homework. And I'm gonna be expelled and not able to go to school anymore to punish because she wants me to be dead. And because of their dogma, they couldn't actually do that. But I had never gotten a good grade after that, regardless how good my work was, ever. After that, I just got Fs, not Fs, but Cs. Never got anything better than that. In about, the revolution broke out in 1956, October 23rd. I don't know if you have studied about the Hungarian Revolution, but there were street-to-street fightings. They were houses being burned, and it started out as a peaceful march like we had here, and then it's ended up to be a full-blown revolution. And after about 2 months, the Russians brought in tanks and a complete army to stifle it. And that's when my mom and my stepfather and by this time I had two little half sisters, uh, decided that it was time for us to leave. My stepfather had a brother in Los Angeles. So we escaped to Austria. Uh, we registered with the Hayas, which was sort of a mistake because Nixon was the acting president because Eisenhower had a heart attack. And Nixon, in his wisdom, decided that only 3 Hungarian Jews could come to the United States to 100 non-Jews. So we had to be put in a camp until our turn came up. And we were in a displaced persons camp in northern Austria. The place we were living it was a gorgeous place. It was the Emperor Franz Joseph Winter Palace, and it was gorgeous. And we were there for 9 months. I had my 16th birthday there. And because I was this strong, healthy girl, and the teenagers, we decided that we're not going to just sit around and wait for nothing to happen. So we started a school, and I became a teacher. And I also worked in a cafeteria to help the old people so they don't have to stand in line. And we had dance classes and for us, and we had actually they even showed us films once a week. I remember seeing the first film. Who was that famous rock star then? Anyhow, he was singer from the South.
Johnny Cash?
No,
Elvis Presley?
That's right. That was the first time I saw my first Elvis Presley movie. And I also, the first time I learned how to dance with a man because our young people had classes and everything. So I was a happy camper. I really loved it being there. I was the first time in my 16 years, I didn't feel like I was either ugly or clumsy or different or anything because I felt like an active part of the community. And then in 1957, September 11th, we arrived to the United States. On the 12th, we arrived in New York, and I remember it was one of those horrible hot nights, and the hotel they put us up, there was no air conditioning, and I thought I will die. And then we came next day to Los Angeles, and I've been living ever since here. I spent 5 months to Belmont High. We lived at East Los Angeles then, Easterton, Alvarado, because that's the only place we could afford to live. And I went to Belmont High for 5 months to an ESL program. And then when I turned 17, I felt that I was too old to go to school and not helping my parents financially. My mother was taking care of old people, and my dad was working for a man who knew half as much as he did, and with minimum wages. I felt that as a 16 years old, I need to participate. So secretly, I went to the Board of Education. I took a test and I got a work permit. And then I went to the Hayas, a Jewish Federation actually, and asked them to find me a job. And I got a job on Culver City. I was a shipping clerk. By this, of course, I didn't have a car. I didn't know how to drive. My English I was here 5 months. Can you imagine how bad it is? I mean, after 62 years, I still speak with an accent. Can you imagine how I spoke then? Anyhow, I got this job as a shipping clerk with a very, very nice family. As a matter of fact, they even picked me up every morning took me to work and bring me home. And I remember I came home and I told my mom what I did, and they were very upset with me because they felt that they didn't leave Hungary. So for me to start to work and not go to school at the age of 17, I gave them my word that I will get an education. I have 2 bachelor's, 2 master's degrees, and an art degree. I am a hospital administrator. I have an MBA in HR, and I paint, sculpt, and do ceramics. And I'm a silversmith. And I have 2 children. I have a son who is a grandson. These are my son and my grandson. And I have a granddaughter. This is my granddaughter. Oh, no, no, this is my daughter. Never mind. This is my daughter and her husband. And this gorgeous thing right here is my granddaughter. And I have a picture of the Danube because of, there is like 35 or 100 people were murdered at the Danube in 1945. And this is the picture of the monument where all the shoes are being put, representing the people who died. Okay, so any questions at all? There is no taboo questions. I will answer anything you ask me. Just go ahead and ask any questions you want.
Thank you. This is snaps as a thank you for sharing. Okay, stretch moment. Thank you so much for sharing. I learn something new every time I hear you. And
I'm always worried that did I say too much, too little?
No, it was perfect. And I loved when you said that it was colder than a witch's tit, by the way. You're allowed to say whatever you want.
I try to be a little, but it doesn't always happen.
It's all good. So I can attest that Ava is a very open person, and she means it when she says you can ask any questions. So I was kind of writing some stuff down when I was listening. I have some questions, but I want to give you guys a chance to ask any questions that you want. And yeah, don't be shy. You can ask fun, easy questions, or you can ask logistical questions or hard questions.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I really appreciate it, and I was really moved by your story. And I had a few questions.
Go ahead.
First, I was wondering what happened to Valerie, I believe.
Okay, it's a good question, and I usually mention it. She was adopted, as I told you, by this man who was working as the underground, the head of the underground. But then when the Communistic took over, he decided to punish the Nazis, so he became part of the Communistic Party. And before we knew, he became the head of the secret police. And my little friend had lived a very, very privileged life because he went so far up in, matter of fact, when they came to see me, it had to be done in secret because my stepfather never joined the Communistic Party, so we were blacklisted. But they would send a car to pick me up like 3 blocks away from where we lived, and I would spend the weekend with them, and we would go vacations together, and it was very, very nice. And then when I left Hungary, she and I kept up relationships. And when I went back the first time to Hungary, I spent a week with her in 1983. But unfortunately, at the age of 40, she died of cancer.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah, me too. Her parents gave me a bracelet and a necklace, which was her favorite, to keep her as a memory. So I still have that.
I had one more question, if that's okay.
Sure.
I was really struck by how you describe your memories. I think you said that if you close your eyes, you can still see it, and you talked about the knitting needles and still being able to hear that sound. I don't know if this is a question necessarily, but I was wondering if you could talk more about how you experience your memories of that time of your life.
Well, I mean, I can actually see and smell. I mean, all it comes back. It comes back just the way how it is. And that's one of the reasons each time I talk, it ends up to be a different talk, because I don't memorize much as memorizing it, but whatever comes up to me at that time is what feels like I need to talk about. A matter of fact, I have learned so much about myself by visualizing this, because different things would come up out of hiding in my brain. And but I experience everything visually. So everything is colors and smells and tactile. You know, I'm very tactile, so everything comes that way. And it's both liberating when I find something new about myself, because it took me years I've been in therapy, in and out of therapy for over 20 years. So I've been getting a lot of help. But um, all of us who went through what I went through, and people who went through the Holocaust, they are all damaged. And in Europe, we didn't get any help. So in the United States, I also was married to a psychologist for 10 years, and I was shrunk a lot. And so I learned a lot about myself. And but each time I talk about these things, it's both liberating, because I discover like why I'm, you know, like even to, I have some phobias right now. And sometimes by talking about it, I understand why the phobias are happening, and it opens up. And so it's liberating, but it's also affecting me many ways. Like almost each time I talk, I ended up have to take afterwards a couple of Advils, because I don't want to get a migraine. I don't want to get a stomach. You know, it affects my body different way. Um, and but basically what it is, it's opening up my history to me, because nobody talked about it. My mother and my stepfather were so damaged that they couldn't talk about it. I would literally have to beg them for some information. Uh, like on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, they both were basket cases, because then all this come up to them. And it took me years and years to learn about my family, because I grew up without any family. And so um, each time I talk, I seem to get to know myself better, and also have a relationship more with my parents, who are no longer living. Uh, they both died partially because they were so damaged that they didn't handle life well. Uh, and but it's both getting me closer to them, and it's also making me understand. I don't know if it makes any sense what I just said.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
Hi, I have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess it's two. The first would be like, when did you find out that your father was not your biological father?
Very good question. I was 12 years old. I already had two half sisters, and which was, my dad was very good man, and he adored me, I used to, but he also was very old fashioned. And I was 10 and a half years old when I became a woman in every way. At 10 years old, I looked like this. And he was very old fashioned. And at that point, until then, I would sit on his lap. He would feed me from his plate. And then when I reached 10 and a half, all of a sudden, not because he felt it was not proper for a big girl to sit on his lap or eating out of his plate. And it came the same time as one of my sisters were born, or both of my sisters were just born. And I remember I felt like I was sort of isolated, and I didn't understand why. And then his sister got mad at my mother. She was like a witch. I mean, better people were burned at Salem than she was. And she wanted to make she wanted to make sure that I found out, and she told the neighbors when she knew I was in earshot. And the way how she said it was very painful. She said, my dad knows that he has his own children. He doesn't have to care for somebody else's brat. That's how I found out. And then it took me several weeks before I had got the courage to face my mother and my stepfather to find out the truth. And that's when I found out about my father and everybody else. It was pain. It took me 2 years to afterwards to make the relationship back to the same way with my parents as it was. Even though that I felt love, I knew that they loved me. I felt both, I felt that they lied to me all those years. They never told me the truth. And I also felt that I was betrayed. And it took a long time for me to able to trust them again in fully. Is that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. And I just wanted to know, like, when you moved to Los Angeles, did you feel like you found one, a community at all that you felt accepted by, or also like was there a Jewish community that you felt connected to?
Uh, First of all, I have read, because of my issues in life, I spent most of my life reading. That's the way I was communicating, because I wasn't very popular at school and all that stuff. So I buried myself in books. So I read everything I could possibly read about the Western world and Australia, because that's where I was hoping that one day I will go. I didn't want to have anything to do with Europe. And so when I came to the United States, I felt that I was coming home. I really loved it. But because of the fact that I went, the only time I went with my own age people, I was in East Los Angeles, where I was the only non-colored person. I was the only one who wasn't either Mexican or Black. Um, I never really fitted in. I mean, people treated me well, but I never fitted in. And then when I went to work right away, I was always with adults. So I never really had a group of friends who were my age. When we came here, my parents right away started to go to work. We had very small amount of social groups. Um, it wasn't, but to me, it was still, I felt that America was the greatest place ever. I did a lot of volunteering then, and I still do. I volunteered with some autistic children. I volunteered in places where, and they needed anybody, a young person to do things for. So, but I had a very small amount of close friends. Uh, but that's part of my nature. I am a very good friend to the few people I am friends with, but I have a lot of acquaintances, but very few close friends. Do you know what I'm trying to say? There is a distance. I mean, I have a lot of people who knows me and I know them, but they only know so much because I don't share more than I have to. Is that answer your
Yeah,
question?
totally. Thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome.
I also had a question.
Go ahead.
I was curious if, like, how you communicated or if you told your children and your grandchildren as they grew up about your experiences.
Well, very little. After a while, my kids saw my mother. My father died when my daughter was 2 years old, so my kids don't have too much memory of them. Here from him, but my mother was this very unusual lady, and in more ways than one. She was a brilliant woman who, but she was really damaged. And so my kids sort of never understood. I mean, they said that while I never talked about it, there was always a black cloud over us. But because my parents had not told me the facts of life, a truth about me until they forced to. I promised myself that I will never lie to my children. So whenever they asked me anything, I would tell them to the level they were able to take it at that time. So little by little, they had known my story, but I didn't start to talk about it for a long time. My grandson actually never heard me speak because my son was married to a woman who sort of would not allow him to know anything about my past. So I don't think he still doesn't know much about it. But my granddaughter knew it from an early age because my daughter also worked for the Shoah Foundation. She was one of the interviewers. She lived in Paris and she was a director of Shoah for 5 years. So she had known all about that, and my granddaughter was exposed to it.
Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
I have a question. I'd be curious to hear
Sure, honey.
if your experience during the Holocaust or kind of processing it afterward ever caused you to either like question your Judaism or change your Judaism at all or your beliefs?
Very good question. I have never wanted to be anything else than Jewish, and partially because I felt that 96% of my family was murdered because they were Jewish. I needed to carry on. I never questioned my Judaism. I am not religious. I belong to an organization called the Jewish Renewal, which is one of those groups which are take the best of everything and throw out the others, and which I can deal with. I had became their event coordinator for the past 35 years. I arrange all the events. I never ever for 1 second denied that I am not that I'm Jewish ever, regardless what the situation is. I don't keep kosher. I can't give up lobster, so I can't keep kosher. I light the Friday night candles even when I am by myself. I live alone, by the way, and so because it reminds me of my mother who had lit the candles every Friday night, even though that it was never publicized that we were Jewish. She had never given that up. I go to Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. You know, as I said, I arrange everything because I am the event coordinator. Our organization has once a month a service, which is really, you should all come. It is the most fun thing you have ever seen. We have musicians. It's like a concert. It's not even like this, you know. But I get very annoyed at the ultra orthodox and them because I feel that instead of uniting, they are separating, and also their behavior sometimes is very objective to me. I mean, I remember my little kids, I put them to Hebrew school, and one Saturday it was hot as hell, and I turned the sprinklers on, and they were running around in their bathing suits in the sprinklers front of the house, and there came a Hasid, and they walked up to him and, Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi. And he looked at me and he says, you are worse than a goy. And I remember my kids looked at me like, what did we do? And I never forgave him because I felt that is the type, that's one of the reasons people don't like us, because of our separation and are thinking that we are better than anybody else or different than anybody else. So I am one of those Jews who will never ever deny it, but I also don't think that I am any better than the rest of the world. Is that answer your question? I take a pride of being a Jew or a heritage. I have a library full of this stuff. I also have artwork here, has a lot to do. I had made 2 menorahs. I can actually show you if you want to. I have made 2 menorahs, candlestick, Kiddush cups, Havdalah sets, I mean, all that kind of stuff. But I am very far from religious, but I'm very spiritually involved in Judaism. Does it make any sense?
Yes, thank you.
I also was curious, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your story. That was incredibly moving. But I was just curious how you transitioned from working to earning your degrees, and especially how you transitioned into your artistic practices, and if that, like if creating art had any role in healing from what you
Well, ever since I can remember, as I mentioned, even as a child, having artsy-fartsy thing was important to me. So when I started to work at 17, I felt that I needed to balance myself out, and I started to do little things at first. My first artwork was painting, and then I went, but I wasn't a Van Gogh, so I put that aside. Then I started to sculpt, but I wasn't a Rodin. Then I did ceramics, but I live in a guest house and had no more room. And I sort of evolved into all different kind of medium. And I, every night, once a week at least, ever since I can remember, I spent in a night school to learn some kind of art. Because I felt that was giving part of my sanity. And also it made me feel, and since I did not have to live off of my art, I had the privilege of making a living in a medical field. I did not have to worry about if I make anything is going to good enough to sell. So I could do whatever I wanted to do, which means a lot to me. And then about 35 years ago, I discovered silversmithing. And I remember walking into a class where everybody was already advanced. And I said, I have this night free and I want to take classes with you. And they said, and that was at Barnesdall. And they said to me, well, we are already an advanced class. We can't spend time with you. Whatever you can pick up is you pick up. I said, okay, that's okay with me. So I am very creative in my work, but I don't really have all the basics as I should have. So everything I make is sort of half-assed, but but I have fun with it, and it has actually, I think, made my life a much better, because when I am angry, I can take a piece of metal up and hammer it, and when I think of Trump, I beat the you know what out of it. It has made me always feel one way of expressing myself without doing any harm to anything or creating something fun. I don't make things about Holocaust. I don't have a Holocaust art. I don't think I do things to create. I do a lot of casting from plants. I have made flowers out of everything. I mean, I made this week. This is from a egg carton. It's a flower made out of egg carton. I also believe that you recycle anything you can, so I try not to throw anything out. So I make jewelry out of scraps of metal, which other people would melt down and do something. I make some things out of it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. I guess one of my questions is that you experienced this when you were really young, and I'm sure there's an element of confusion in terms of what was really occurring. And I was wondering at what point in time you understood sort of the whole forces going on behind the scenes.
I didn't. I don't think I knew that not everybody lived the way I lived until I was 4.5.
Mm-hmm.
I was too young. I was not even 2 years old when I was taken into hiding. So I don't know if I ever realized that that was not part of life. I just accepted it, that I had to be always quiet, that I can only go to the bathroom when I'm told, that I can't take a bath and all that kind of stuff. That's why the few times I took a bath was such an important thing to me. I didn't realize that I think until after the war, and it took a long time after the war, I remember, to become socialized again, because I didn't even know how to behave in public. It took several steps before I was able to feel comfortable. And to this day, I don't feel comfortable in crowds, for instance. Even when I used to march against the Vietnamese War, I would go on the sidewalk, not with the crowd, because I wanted to have a sense of I can always escape if I had to. When I go to a movie theater, I make sure that I know every exit sign or a theater. I try to sit at the aisle so I can get up and leave. I mean, certain things had never left, but it took a long time, plus because my parents were not that open about discussing it. It took a long time before I was able to digest and also understand the whole thing, and I'm still doing it, I think. I understand, and I try to work on myself all the time to make sure that some of the damage gets wiped away.
Thank you so much.
I have another question. You mentioned that you have returned to Hungary. What was that like, and did your parents ever return to their home?
Well, my mother went back to Budapest way before I did first time. because when we left everything behind. And when I was getting married in 1960, my mom wanted to get some of my things to me so I have it for, but by the time she went back, almost everything was sold. The people who were supposed to watch over it, it was all taken away. I have one pillowcase with my name on it, which I never use, but it's in my closet. But anyhow, but I didn't go back until 1983 when my two kids, one was 17 and the other was 19, said that it is time for me to face my past so I can have a future, they felt. And they insisted on that we go back to Europe because that was the first, I was not going to do it ever again. I just didn't want to have anything to do with it. And we spent 6 weeks in Europe. We traveled through Europe and we spent a week in Hungary. And I'm glad I did it because it had opened up areas which I had been locking away. But like I didn't go to the monument on the river until just 3 years ago, the first time, when my two half sisters insisted that we're gonna go there because I could never face some of those things. I was very selective of what, and also Hungary has never been a place for me of even though it's a beautiful country and Budapest is gorgeous. I have only bad memories in Hungary, so it was not like I was looking forward going back. I just wanted to see the few relatives I have. Each time I went back, it was like one foot was there and the other foot was ready to leave. But I've been back about 6 times since we left Hungary. But the first time it was in 1983.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions or any requests or anything?
I have some questions that I'm going to ask you later because they are.
Go ahead, ask.
Okay, I'm going to choose one because I want to be respectful of all of us probably having to go to the bathroom. But I wanted to know, you mentioned, and I always find this to be like a really pivotal and important moment in your story and your telling of it, when the man told you that he wanted you to basically bear witness to him saving you. Do you ever know what happened to him, or?
Well, my mother and I were called to court.
Okay.
I remember I was dressed up into sailor skirt, a pleated skirt and stockings, and I'm not stockings, but knee socks. And, I remember all dressed up for me. And I remember going to court, and I remember how petrified I was because, first of all, we went into this room with the first time in this kind of room with all the judges, and then I saw in the guilty areas, they were all these Nazis, and we were not the only witnesses. And I remember I was called and I had to identify if I remember any of this person. And I remember my mother said it was okay to do it, but I remember my stomach was churning and it was very scary and my hand was wet, and I remember holding onto my mother and I pointed to the guy. I do not know what happened to him. As I said, my parents were not very verbal when it came to anything. They thought they had to protect me from everything after the war. But even though that he saved the 3 of us, he had killed several hundred. So I don't know what happened. It's possible that he maybe got less, they were more lenient because he saved 3 people, but I don't know. I really don't. And I have to admit that I never wanted to know. The first many years after the war, my feeling is the best Nazi and a German was a dead one. So I never really, it took me many, many years, then I don't feel the same way about Germany as I did before. And I don't judge everybody just by I had learned to think and feel the way I psychologically I want to. And it took me a long self process to do so because I was very, very hurt for a long time in many ways. Does that answer your question, hon?
Yeah, I've never asked you that, and it's really interesting to find out that you did actually come face to face with him again. Another question that I have, I wrote down a few moments when the underground rescued you and your mother and your friend. And I'm wondering if they were ever honored for that work, and if anything ever came of the underground being so important to the rescue of so many Jews in Hungary. And then also, if you ever knew kind of how those men on the horses were able to find you and rescue you.
Well, apparently, because of the fact that my grandfather was working with the underground and for so many years and spent so much of his wealth on helping the underground, when they took my family away, they had sort of decided that was a mission for them to save my mother and me, because we were the only people left. And apparently there were somebody who was keeping an eye on us most of the time. So it wasn't, there was not somebody watching us, but they sort of knew where we were at all times. And so the 4 men were sent to pick us up because they knew that we were picked up and taken away. But what happened to them, the 4 men, I don't know. As I said, if my parents would have been the kind of people that they would talk to me about it, it was different. But I remember that after the war, my mother and I would take food to people, and I never was explained why. You know what I mean? We would give them, my stepfather would send money with me to people's houses, and I never knew why. I was just told that because they were nice people and they could use the money. And but later I found out that those were the people who at one point helped us, and my father felt that he needed to reciprocate. And when the revolution broke out, and the head of the person who was head of the secret police, who originally was part of the underground, he got into trouble because he was the head of the secret police during the revolution. My father sent me in middle of the revolution to Budapest to get him and his colleagues, and we hid them for 2 months in our workshop, at my father's workshop, and to make sure that they will not hang them up, because all the revolutionaries hang them up on the light poles by their feet or my neck and let them dangle. And so my father said that these people had saved my life and my mother's life. It couldn't happen to them. And so we hid them for like 2 months.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think that we could all stay here for an hour. Asking more questions. Your life has been incredible and full of remarkable historical moments and experiences. So I look forward to hopefully reconnecting this summer, and maybe we can have you back to continue this conversation and answer.
Anytime. Except for going to dancing each night, I have nothing.
What dancing are you going to?
I'm just joking. I am basically living in the house all the time.
Okay, well.
I am free anytime you want me.
Okay, thank you so much. We're incredibly grateful.
It was very nice meeting you, young people. And thank you for staying on so I could see your faces.
Of course. Okay, sending you all the love, and thank you again. And to the rest of you, is 30 minutes enough to kind of like feed yourselves and go to the bathroom and everything? Yeah, okay, so let's reconvene at 12:30.
By the way, if any of you want to talk to me about anything, she has my information. You're welcome to call me or whatever.
Thank you. Okay, I'll talk to you later this afternoon, Ava, and I'll see you guys in 30 minutes.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Have a nice break.